Okay, this is going to be a crazier one than I expected. Earlier this week, a feud erupted on Twitter between Elon Musk and this guy named Roman Helmet Guy about the fall of Rome. And yes, this was trending on Twitter, and it led me down a rabbit hole. I want to explain to you today the actual historical evidence for the fall of Rome and why nothing these guys say makes any sense. The second thing that it led me down a rabbit hole is about Elon Musk's views on history itself, the big picture of history. And it's absolutely wild. It's another one of these doomsday apocalyptic sort of views, and he uses it to justify his entire worldview. So this is Archaeology with Flint Dibble. I'm Flint Dibble. Let's dig into Elon Musk and the fall of Rome. So this is absolutely wild. This is the Twitter thread that everybody's been laughing about. In a sense, Elon Musk says no foreign policy actions can save a civilization if its population keeps dropping. Population collapse of Romans over time is what caused Rome to fall. Roman Helmet Guy says, no, it's actually the barbarians that came in, the Goths and the Vandals. And Elon Musk replies, read more. And Roman Helmet Guy says, Elon, I'm underemployed reading primary sources from Roman history all day while you are running 5 companies. I'm sorry, but I know more about Rome than you. To which Elon Musk replies, no, you don't. In the end, I think that neither of these guys have the picture right. Let's get a sense of what we should be thinking about and why Elon should not be trusted when it comes to Roman history. And that's a well-known fact among Roman historians, by the way. Here is Mary Beard expressing that very point.
I have to say that if I was to give anybody a warning tonight, I would say that if ever they see a tweet from Musk saying anything about the Roman Empire, go and do a bit of research.
Check it with you first.
Because 9 times out of 10, it is sheer rubbish.
Exactly. Elon Musk has tweeted a whole lot about the Roman Empire, and it is not even 9 times out of 10. It is 10 times out of 10 sheer rubbish. Mary Beard is absolutely correct. So when we talk about the fall of Rome, this is actually a fairly complex phenomenon. If we go back, for example, to the summary of this debate by Grok, you can even see that Grok gets this right. At the end, historians emphasize the fall of Rome involved multiple factors, including invasions, economic issues, and plagues, not a single cause. Notably, what's missing is Elon Musk's big bugbear, which is fertility and the birth rate. And we're going to get into that in some depth. So when we talk about the fall of Rome, we are predominantly talking about the fall of the Western Roman Empire. So here is Dr. Paul Friedman summarizing the collapse of the political union of the Western Roman Empire, because that's what we mean. It's a political collapse in many ways. So here's Dr. Paul Friedman from Yale giving a lecture to some of his students there.
Today we're going to talk about the transformation of the Roman Empire, and I use the somewhat neutral and undramatic word transformation. It can be fall of the Roman Empire, collapse of the Roman Empire. Be clear that we're talking about the fall of the Western Empire. Next week we'll talk about the survival of the Eastern Empire. From 410 to 480, the Western Roman Empire disintegrated. It was dismembered by barbarian groups who were, except for the Huns, not really very barbarian. That is, they were not intent on mayhem and destruction. All they really wanted to do was to be part of the empire, to share in its wealth and accomplishments, rather than to destroy it. Nevertheless, 476 is the conventional date for the end of the Western Empire, because in that year, a barbarian chieftain deposed a Roman emperor. Nothing very new about this for the 5th century.
So what we're thinking about here is a political collapse. And this is actually something that historians have documented as a long-term process that takes several centuries. It's not a sudden event, though the traditional view, as Paul just sort of explained, shows some of these sudden events of the 5th century, but that has a long lead up. So we can see, for example, the division of the Roman Empire, for example, into four parts in the 4th century, and this really sticks into two parts, the Western versus the Eastern Empire after Constantine. And so this is the initial sort of political disintegration, one could say, of the Roman Empire. And this accelerates, of course, into the 5th century. With the 5th century, what we could think of as the Roman Empire, this is 457, so before that 476 date. In red is what is still controlled by the Roman Empire, and then there's these other kingdoms that are sort of growing around it. Now, to make sure that we don't overemphasize this collapse, because what's going on is the Roman Empire is more than just the Western Roman Empire, and the Eastern Roman Empire actually stays stable for another millennium. And we call that the Byzantine Empire, though, of course, they did not call that the Byzantine Empire. They called that the Roman Empire. So, in many ways, we really need to repicture our understanding of this collapse. It's not simple because we see that half of it actually continues as a successful political entity into the future, while the other half splinters into these kind of kingdoms. So, what is Elon Musk claiming is the cause for this? He repeats the cause multiple times. Here he is last year on Lex Friedman talking about the fall of Rome.
As soon as any given civilization reaches a level of prosperity, the birth rate drops. And now you can go and look at the same thing happening in ancient Rome. So Julius Caesar took note of this, I think, around 50-ish BC, and tried to pass, I don't know if he was successful, tried to pass a law to give an incentive for any Roman citizen that would have a third child. And I think Augustus was able to, well, he was, the dictator, so this Senate was just for show. I think he did pass a tax incentive for Roman citizens to have a third child, but those efforts were unsuccessful. Rome fell because the Romans stopped making Romans. That's actually the fundamental issue. And there were other things. There was like, they had like quite a series of malaria epidemics and plagues and whatnot. But they had those before. It's just that the birth rate was far lower than the death rate.
Now, this is wrong on so many levels. I almost don't even know where to begin. First of all, we have absolutely no understanding of the birth rate in ancient Rome. There is no fertility records. There's literally nothing that we can use to estimate fertility in the ancient world. We don't have records of live births. And what we do have an understanding of is actually that the birth rate in pre-modern civilizations was quite high. And we estimate that it's similar in Rome compared to other ones, which is that women actually have 5 to 6 children, and about a third to half of them are passing away due to infant mortality. I have a whole video on infant mortality, the Agora bone well, if you want to check out the results of it in ancient Athens that you could see after this. The other big problem with what Musk is talking about here is the evidence that he cites. He cites this fertility law passed by Augustus, the first Roman Empire, encouraging women and families to have 3 children. What's the problem with that? The problem with that is that this is at the beginning of the Roman Empire, not the end of the Roman Empire. It's completely disconnected. And in fact, the estimates of population show that population grows after Augustus's period for the next 2 centuries. In fact, some population estimates include that it grows by 30 to 40%. And what causes population decline has nothing to do with birth rate, has nothing to do with fertility, but instead has to do with another series of economic and, in particular, health disasters and climate disasters that strike the Roman Empire from the 3rd century, 4th century, and 5th century. And that has nothing to do with fertility. There is no discussion about dropping birth rates. Elon Musk is quite literally making this up. He's not making this up. I've tracked down where he gets this from, but he repeats this false information all the time. Here are tweets of his going back over the last 3 years, talking about birth rates causing the end of the ancient Roman Empire, when I cannot emphasize enough, no historian talks about this because we have no credible evidence related to birth rates. So where is Elon Musk getting this narrative from? Well, this took some work. This is part of the rabbit hole I've gone down for you. He is getting it from a very specific book. Here he is talking about it.
And if you look at the history of civilizations, which I encourage people to read, the history of civilizations. In fact, there's literally a book called The Story of Civilization. It's quite good.
So that's the book he's getting it from. He's getting it from The Story of Civilizations, written by Will Durant. And this is a book from 1944. I cannot emphasize that enough. This is a book from 1944, written by an eminent professor, but not a professor of history, a professor of philosophy. Will Durant, 1944. It is absolutely out of date. Our understanding of Roman demographics, our understanding of Roman settlements, our understanding of Roman archaeology, inscriptions, and texts has changed dramatically in the last 80 years. And Elon Musk is going around parroting material that is written during World War II, essentially during a completely different period by someone who was not a trained historian and did not have access to the evidence base that we have today that shows the complexity that is the fall of Rome, especially the fall of the Western Roman Empire. I should clarify, because of course the Eastern Roman Empire continues. And so we actually have a whole lot more evidence for it. So we showed Elon Musk on Lex Fridman from last year. A month later, Lex Fridman hosted a good Roman archaeologist and historian, Dr. Greg Aldrete. And here he is talking about the complexity of evidence and piecing out just when we can pinpoint the fall of Rome.
This is a real game. Pick your favorite date for the fall of the Roman Empire. 476 is a very common one. And what happens in that year is a barbarian king comes down into Italy and deposes a guy named Romulus Augustulus, which is an amazing name. It's combining the names of the founder of Rome, Romulus, with Augustus, the second founder of Rome. And so some people say that's the end of the Roman Empire. Sure. But others say it's 410 when Alaric sacks Rome for the first time. Others say it's 455 when the Vandals come and sack Rome and do a much more thorough job of it this time. Some say it's 180 when Marcus Aurelius picks poorly in succession. Some say it's 31 when Octavian wins the Battle of Actium and kills the Roman Republic. Or you can go past that date and say it's 1453 when the Eastern Roman Empire finally falls. And I mean, the Eastern Empire is legitimately the Roman Empire. If you were going to ask them, who are you? They wouldn't say, we're the Byzantines, we're the Eastern Roman Empire. They would just say, we're the Romans. And they have a completely legitimate claim to do that. So this whole game of when does the empire fall is problematic. And the other thing is all those dates about invasions that cluster around the 400s, so 410, 455, 476, you have to ask yourself, who counts as a real Roman by that point? Because for a while now, the Romans themselves are often coming from barbarians, are crossing that boundary. Roman generals, they might get raised as a Hun, then serve with the Roman army for a while, then not, or Visigoths or not. That's been going on for a long time. So what makes someone a real Roman? How do you tell that the guy kicked out in 476 was a, quote, real Roman and the barbarian king who took his place wasn't? That's a very arbitrary decision.
That is how a real Roman historian sounds. We deal with actual evidence, actual dates, actual facts, and we realize that our view of the past, trying to simplify it, doesn't always work. The reality of the collapse of the Western Roman Empire is extremely complex. It's a slow-moving process that takes place over centuries, to the point where historians cannot even document exactly when it happens. And at the same time, the identities of these individuals involved, barbarian versus Roman, is far more complex than the caricature of Roman history that pervades the public discourse that Elon engages in. Elon is clearly not an actual historian because he thinks there's just one fucking cause, and a cause for which there is a single bit of evidence: declining birth rates. So let's look at the complexity again with Dr. Greg Aldrete of why the Roman Empire collapses.
I mean, this is the other game, as people like to say, when did the Roman Empire fall? The other big question is why? Why did the Roman Empire fall? If you define it as falling. And I mean, barbarian invasions was the traditional answer. So there's a French historian who famously said, the Roman Empire didn't fall, it was murdered. It was killed by barbarians. But I mean, there's other explanations. Some people say it was Christianity. Some say it was climate, that the Roman Empire flourished during this moment of luck when just the climate was good. And then you get this sort of late Roman little ice age and everything goes downhill. And that's what caused it. There's some that say things like disease. There were a whole series of waves of plague that started to hit under Marcus Aurelius and continued after him, which seemed to have caused real serious death and economic disruption. I mean, that's a decent explanation. Another popular one is moral decline, which I don't think really works well. You even get the people saying, lead poisoning, but that's not true because they were drinking out of the same pipes when the empire was expanding.
So there we go. There's a bazillion different explanations, many of them good, some of them bad. And the bad ones are moral decline and fertility birth rates, because we have zero evidence for those. And Elon Musk repeatedly emphasizing these is simply not accurate, and you should not be listening to him, as Mary Beard says. So the reality is that the crux of the fall of the Western Roman Empire comes down to two camps in ancient historians. There are the catastrophists, or the collapse people, that believe that this is a collapse. And then there are the continuists, those who believe that this is actually a transformation. And so let's hear Paul Friedman sort of summarize this debate.
The world of late Roman historians is divided, roughly speaking, between catastrophists and continuists. As you may guess, the catastrophists think the fall of the Roman Empire, whether we date it 476, or there's some reasons to date it really 550 for reasons we'll learn next week, between 450 and 550, a catastrophe happened. A civilization was wiped out, and really, if not literally a dark ages, a more primitive, more warlike, more illiterate, and more rural period was ushered in. The disappearance of ancient texts, things that the Romans knew from that lost Hortensius dialogue of Cicero that Augustine was so fond of, to many other kinds of works that had been known to the Roman world, right? I can't remember exactly how many plays Aeschylus wrote, but it's something on the order of 60, and we have 3. So the disappearance of texts, the end of literacy, except for a very small portion of the Christian clergy. A more primitive architecture, the end of grand civic projects like aqueducts, colosseums, theaters, baths. A more isolated society without these urban centers, a diminished population spread across the countryside, mostly engaged in subsistence. Hence the, if not end of trade, the radical diminution of trade. The continuists, people like Collins, whom I just quoted, see the political changes as dramatic, all right, but as essentially surface phenomena, based partly on archaeology and partly on a more sympathetic understanding of Christian practices. In other words, they don't think that the proliferation of churches, saints, cults is necessarily a sign of primitiveness. So based on both archaeology and an understanding of Christianity, these continuists point to the survival of trade, the role of bishops and other church officials as replacing the Roman governors. The Roman political order may have collapsed in terms of staffing by lay people and military people, but the bishops were now the rulers of the city. The bishops would now do things like ensure the food supply, rally the local population against barbarian invasions, educate the populace. And the barbarian kings themselves try, with some success, to perpetuate the Roman order. They collect taxes, for example. May or may not be a good thing. They engage in some kind of public works, some kind of maintenance of order. the civilization of the 6th and 7th centuries in what comes to be considered Western Europe rather than the Western Roman Empire is not radically more barbarized or primitive than the late Roman Empire, thus the continuists.
So there we have it. These are the two camps, the catastrophists and the continuists. And it's not even as simple as that. The idea of this being a catastrophe, such as we see, for example, in memes like this, the hole left by the Christian Dark Ages, which represents the collapse of all scientific progress, this is just public perception. Even the catastrophists that Dr. Friedman was describing would not subscribe to a graph such as this. The catastrophe is not so grim and not so dark. And in particular, it is far more slow moving, though it's punctuated by a few different major events that hindered the sort of the reformation of the Roman Empire after its, especially the Western Roman Empire after its political disintegration. If you want a really good update, a modern take on the sort of catastrophist approach, I would suggest reading Kyle Harper's The Fate of Rome, published in, I think, 2017, 2018. I'm forgetting the exact date. This is a fantastic read, and he puts together a wide variety of historical, archaeological, environmental, and in particular, evidence for disease burden. This is one of the key points that he brings to bear, that archaeologists are actually really modifying our picture of what's happening at this time with our evidence for disease burden, and in particular plagues. And so there's two key points here that he makes. One of them is the impact of disease, and in particular the severe impact of disease. And here he is.
The period that I normally work on is sort of from the High Roman Empire, so like the glory days of the Pax Romana in the 1st or 2nd century, which is usually where I start, through what we call the late antique or early medieval period, so the 6th or 7th century. And at the beginning of this period, Rome dominates this Mediterranean empire. It's what you think of when you think of ancient Rome. It's the largest city in the world. It's the center of this huge network. And then by the end of this period, the city of Rome has, we don't know, 50 to 100,000 people. It's a 10th or 20th of its former size. And I think we now can say pretty clearly that environmental factors like climate, but also especially diseases, play a part in that really big transformation. And well, there's a problem because we don't have the same kind of modern government mortality statistics that we do for like COVID or even for the last century or century and a half. We have to piece together from clues, but it's pretty clear that the bubonic plague events, whether you're talking about the Black Death of the 14th century, the plague of Justinian in the 6th century, these events are capable of causing death rates temporarily that are just orders of magnitude beyond what we're accustomed to. And even in these ancient societies, the reason why these were so shocking in a world where the death rate's always pretty high, probably several percent of the Roman population, 3-4% a year, may be dying in a normal year. And so for them to just be utterly shocked by the death rate already tells you that it's some multiple of what they're accustomed to.
So this gives you a sense of the impact of one of these plague events, the Justinian plague. And that takes place in the 6th century after the political fragmentation that we've already looked at. And so in many ways, as Dr. Kyle Harper is saying to Dwarkesh Patel, is that this is preventing the reconstitution of the Roman Empire by the Emperor Justinian, who had reconquered Italy and was actually on the process of reconstituting the Roman Empire. He was able to keep together the Eastern Roman Empire. The second aspect that Kyle Harper talks about in his book, The Fate of Rome, which I highly recommend everybody read, is just how slow going this process is. These climate impacts and disease impacts do not start this late. We see the reduction in what's going on in the Roman Empire really from the 3rd century onwards. There's what's called the 3rd century crisis. And this is precipitated by the Antonine Plague, which Kyle Harper has a whole chapter on. It's a really catching chapter because Galen, the ancient physician, was there. But this is also backed up by archaeological evidence that shows a major decline in the Roman economy from the 3rd century onwards. We can see this in the debasement of the coinage, or in this graph from an article by Andy Wilson, which I'll put in the comment in the description of the video below, which shows a drop-off in shipwrecks, a severe drop-off in shipwrecks, Some of this drop off is due to the visibility of shipwrecks. Amphorae, made out of clay, stopped being used as frequently from the 2nd century AD onwards, and they're replaced slowly by barrels. And barrels disintegrate, are more likely to disintegrate, I should say. However, even if we just look at shipwrecks that have stone, we can see this major drop off in trade starting in the 4th century. And so, there's a huge drop off and decline in the functioning of and health of the Roman Empire that we can trace politically through its initial fragmentation into 4 parts. We can trace it economically, and this occurs hundreds of years before what we think of as the collapse of Rome. So this is obviously, even the catastrophists see this as an extremely slow-moving process. The collapse of the Western Roman Empire is a process, not an event. So even seeing it as a catastrophe is probably the wrong term, because this is taking place over many, many generations, very slowly. And this, of course, then leads to the second camp, who are the transformists, who believe that Rome did not just, the continuists, I should say. And podcaster Mike Duncan of the podcast, The History of Rome, summarizes this up quite well.
I mean, Rome is a huge civilization that we see the entire course of it from its founding to its growth, to its peak, to its decline, to its fall. Was it even a fall? Was it merely a transformation? It's probably just a transformation. Calling it a fall is probably too dramatic. And of course, the Eastern Empire is going to keep going for another.
So this gives you a sense that this is actually, I think, in my mind, the predominant view of ancient historians right now, is this idea that it's a transformation. Because what we're seeing is something that takes place so slowly, and the more we delve into the depth and detail of the historical and archaeological record, we see more and more evidence for social continuity. Alice Roberts' new book, Domination, which just came out this year, actually summarizes this up quite well. She writes, for example, I think it's chapter 2, keeping it in the family. And she documents really quickly that we have this richness of textual historical record for 5th century Gaul that provides us with amazingly detailed glimpses into events and experiences, with a narrow lens into these literate elites. But what it does is it allows us to trace families through time and see how interconnected they all were. Careful analysis of text has shown that the transformation of Gaul into a Visigothic and then Frankish kingdom actually involved a lot of continuity among the ruling elites, with the same families holding on to power down through generations, and plenty of close family connections between leading clerics and other aristocrats, which can be traced through hereditary names. And so what we're actually seeing is a huge amount of continuity, particularly among this kind of middle class of elites that maintain their positions of power, from the Roman political nexus to the Christian religious nexus. So the cultural power, the wealth, is being maintained. And this is where a lot of the arguments for continuity come from. In many ways, the continuists, they argue that what we're really seeing is a transformation from sort of state to church in terms of who is holding power. And so in that sense, it very much represents a continuity. And it also does not represent a break in how Roman political and religious rule happened during the empire anyway. Powerful political families not only held powerful political positions, they also held powerful priestly positions, first in the pagan cults and then in the Christian cults. You can even think of the very first emperor of Rome and his pride at being Pontifex Maximus, which, of course, as you can tell from the title, is the predecessor to the Pontifex, the Pope. And so this continuity happens, and this is the reality of the debate, with real evidence, clear textual, historical, and archaeological evidence for how Rome falls. So it strikes me as absolutely, I don't know, disingenuous that Elon Musk goes around and keeps repeating his idea about these birth rates, for which we have zero evidence. I cannot emphasize enough. Zero evidence. Here he is during a Trump campaign rally in 2024 outside of Philadelphia talking about the fall of Rome.
What ended most civilizations was a low birth rate. An extended period of prosperity seems to cause birth rates to plummet. And it's somewhat counterintuitive. When a society is under stress, birth rates increase. So if you look at, say, ancient Rome, the birth rates were super high when they were fighting the Carthaginians, and Rome's very life was at stake. Birth rates were all-time high. After they defeated Carthage and ruled the Mediterranean, the birth rates plummeted. And to such a degree that Julius Caesar even tried to pass, laws like in 50 BC or something like that to give an incentive for any Roman citizen that would have a second or third child. So they were having birth rate issues in 50 BC, which is pretty wild. And that was also true of really basically every civilization throughout history. So how do you avoid this birth rate collapse, the trap of, it's a sort of prosperity trap? I don't have a great answer for that, except I think if we can at least bring it to conscious awareness that we need to continue as a civilization, like no humans, no humanity.
So this brings us to the crux here, the rabbit hole that in many ways I've fallen down, which is that this wrong view on history serves to inform Elon's political worldview, economic worldview, and personal worldview. So we can see most clearly the political relationship between fake history and the fall of Rome and collapse of civilizations, etc., and political decisions today in this clip from Tucker Carlson about the fall of Rome.
How did Rome fall? Historians have been debating that question, well, moving on 2,000 years now. But everyone agrees one of the reasons is pretty obvious. Roman military, its legions, became dominated by non-citizens who, in the end, because they weren't loyal to Rome, turned against Rome's citizens. So knowing that as we do, consider this series of facts. This country has been flooded with tens of millions of illegal aliens.
You can see immediately how he connects immigration in late Rome to immigration today. And this is completely false. In fact, Elon Musk shares this opinion as well and has been debunked by Roman historians on Twitter. So, for example, a couple years ago, Elon tweeted, "Near the fall of the Roman Empire, the Roman army also increasingly relied on non-citizens." And Dr. Jeroen W.P. Wijnendale, sorry if I'm pronouncing your name wrong, Jeroen, "The Roman Republic army that went on to conquer the entire Mediterranean world in 2 centuries drew half of its manpower from non-citizen allies. So key. But hey, you do you." And this is the core here. There is plentiful evidence for non-Roman citizens in the Roman military from the very beginning of Roman history. This is not something new. This is something that begins with the very birth of Rome. As soon as Rome starts subjugating cities nearby in Italy, it draws upon their subjugates, which they call allies, of course, but they're really just subjugated cities that are forced to be allies, and populates its army with these foreigners. And there's a fantastic article online by ancient historian Dr. Brett Devereaux called "Who Were the Romans? Part 5, Saving and Losing the Empire." And it actually walks through this history very clearly of the military, starting with the Socii, these allies in the Republican period that conquered most of the Mediterranean alongside the legions. And he describes how they were actually integrated into Roman history and society, or into Roman culture and society, when after their time of service, they were given citizenship. When the Republic switched to the Empire, a new system was installed that was very similar. It's called the auxiliaries. And these, again, were made up of non-Roman citizens, and their loyalty was guaranteed because they were granted citizenship at the end of their tenure. They were also given excellent pay, and they were also given a share of the war loot during wars. So this is non-citizens in the Roman military has been around since the beginning of Rome through the Roman Empire. They made up about half of the Roman military at all times. This is not something new. And in fact, what changes is Roman attitudes towards foreigners in their military. In the 4th and 5th centuries, they set up a new system called the foederati. And these foederati no longer are granted citizenship after their own tenure. And what they are given instead is land. And they're still ruled by their own kings, who are Roman, as we've seen. As Greg Aldrete mentions, the division between barbarian and Roman is weird and nominal sometimes, and oftentimes just our own perception. But in this case, these foederati were kept kind of at arm's length. And in many ways, what Brett Devereaux argues is that it's this change in status of the foederati that's less inclusive, that does a worse job of including them into the glory that is Rome, that leads to much of the infighting that we see. This is not a story of barbarians coming from outside and invading Rome. What this is a story of infighting of foederati and different Roman generals and different Roman empires, all fighting civil wars with each other and having shifting alliances time and time again. That is what leads to the dissolution of the Roman Empire. And as Brett argues, Dr. Devereaux argues at the end of this post, which I'll put the link below, is that actually what made the empire possible was its ability to effectively manage diverse populations. And when it stops being able to do this, that is what we see as kind of the end of Roman political hegemony in the West. And so this reading of history and applying it to politics is extremely problematic. But Elon goes even a step further. His ideas on birth rate and fertility, they're not just about the Roman Empire, they're about his entire view of history. Here he is describing this to Tucker Carlson.
But you think that we take our existence here for granted?
Yeah, I think
that there are threats to it.
Yeah, exactly. So, I just think we should not assume that civilization is robust. And if you look at the history of civilizations, the rise and fall of the ancient Egyptians, the ancient Sumerians, Rome, there's throughout the world there've been rise and fall of many civilizations. So there's an arc. There's sort of a life cycle arc to civilizations, just as there is to individual humans.
Yes.
And I think we just want to make sure that we have civilization go onward and upward. And that's, for example, why I'm concerned about decreasing birth rates and the fact that, for example, Japan had twice as many deaths last year as births. So that's and they're a leading indicator.
Can I say, and you've written and talked a lot about this, but can I just ask you to pause just for a parenthetical note? Why is that? I mean, the urge to have sex and to procreate is, after breathing and eating, the most basic urge. Yeah. How has it been subverted?
Well, it's just in the past we could rely upon simple limbic system rewards
yes.
in order to procreate. But once you have birth control and abortions and whatnot, now you can still satisfy the limbic instinct, but not procreate. So we haven't yet evolved to deal with that, because this is all fairly recent, the last 50 years or so, for birth control. So yeah, so I'm sort of worried that, hey, civilization, if we don't make enough people to at least sustain our numbers, perhaps increase a little bit, then civilization is going to crumble. And if there's the old question of like, will civilization end with a bang or a whimper? Well, it's currently trending to end with a whimper in adult diapers.
Yes.
Which is depressing as hell.
The most depressing.
I mean, seriously, yeah.
War is less depressing.
Yeah, I'd rather go out with a bang.
Yeah,
Wow, that is there's a lot there. That is a very creepy worldview. I am not sure if war is better. In fact, I think it's 100% worse. Another key point is that the world's population is increasing. It's not decreasing at all on a worldwide global level. So we're in no way near ending civilization due to birth rates. But obviously there's also the weird creepiness with what they're talking about sexuality. And I don't really like to parse people's individual lives, but Elon Musk has an odd personal life story with all of his children, and there's an article that came out this last year in April in 2025, talking about his legion of babies, as he calls them. He actually names his babies after the Roman legions, and there's a lot of connections between his worldview on history, this misguided and inaccurate view of history, with, of course, his personal life. For example, this article is about his children with Ashley St. Clair, and the child's name is Romulus. So you can see immediately that connection with ancient Rome. And to note that he has at least 14 children with 4 women, maybe some that we don't know about. In fact, Elon Musk has tweeted out, I forgot to get the screenshot, that he is doing his part to repopulate the world. You can go find that tweet. But it's insane how this is all wrapped up. His view of history, his personal life, and even his business ventures. So this article in the Wall Street Journal writes, Musk's baby making project is relevant to his ambition for NASA, which he wants to move faster to go to Mars. He said on X that making people multiplanetary is critical to ensuring the long-term survival of humanity and life as we know it, because in his view of the world, civilization is under threat because of a declining population. And he wants to correct this by seeding the Earth with more humans of higher intelligence, according to people familiar with the matter. And so his businesses are set up to serve this idea. And he refers to his offspring as Legion, referencing the military units from Rome. And he even, during Ashley St. Clair's pregnancy, he suggested that they bring in other women to have even more of their children faster, quote, to reach Legion level before the apocalypse. He said to St. Clair in a text message viewed by the Wall Street Journal, we will need to use surrogates. So this is absolutely creepy and weird. I'm not going to move beyond that level of judgment. But it is clear through that text message and through other sources that his view on history is what is informing his view on populating the world, and what is informing his view in terms of his own personal life. And now I want to delve into how his view of history, from astronomical and global history to human history, and how it fuels how he funds his businesses, particularly SpaceX. Here he is talking to Lex Friedman about the need to become multiplanetary.
And the sun is expanding slowly, but it will overheat. It will heat the Earth up at some point in the future, boil the oceans, and Earth will become like Venus, where no life as we know it is impossible. So if we do not become multiplanetary and ultimately go beyond our solar system, annihilation of all life on Earth is a certainty. A certainty. And it could be as little as, on the galactic timescale, 500 million years. You know, it's a long time by human standards, but that's only 10% longer than Earth has been around at all.
Mm-hmm.
So if life had taken 10% longer to evolve on Earth, it wouldn't exist at all.
We got a deadline coming up.
Yeah.
Better hurry. But that said, as you said, humans, intelligent life on Earth developed a lot of cool stuff very quickly. So
Yes.
it seems like becoming a multiplanetary is almost inevitable, unless we destroy.
We
this
need to
thing.
do it. I mean, it's not. I mean, I suspect that there, if we are able to go out there and explore other star systems, there's a good chance we find a whole bunch of long dead one planet civilizations.
Yeah,
That never made it past their home planet.
that's so sad.
Yeah.
Sad. Also fascinating.
I mean, there are various explanations for the Fermi paradox, and one is the sort of, there are these great filters which civilizations don't pass through, and one of those great filters is, do you become a multi-planet civilization or not? And if you don't, it's simply a matter of time before something happens on your planet, either natural or man-made, that causes us to die out, like the dinosaurs. Where are they now? They didn't have spaceships.
And here we are, back to a doomsday cult. This is not where I expected my research into Elon Musk and the fall of Rome to head. As you know, I just produced a video on Graham Hancock's doomsday cult. This is obviously a very different iteration of this, but the vision of the past and the future that Elon Musk preaches to audiences of millions at a time is very much predicated upon apocalypse and doomsday. And what's funny is he references stuff that is 500 billion years away. The heating of the overheating of the sun that will turn this planet into, what was it, Venus. And so it's just like, that is 500 billion years away. That is not something we need to be concerned with. Yet somehow he uses that as justification for us to become multiplanetary right now. And his urgency, I think, is actually better explained through his view not on astronomical and geological disasters, which are extremely far away, nowhere near time, but actually his view of human civilization. Here he is actually talking to a fan club from Silicon Valley, a group of investors into his companies, about his view on human history and why it informs him of the necessity of becoming multiplanetary right now.
I mean, the ancient Egyptians had like a 2,500 year run ish. That's a very long time. Like 10 times longer than the United States has been a country. So, but still they died out. The ancient Sumerians died out. They were arguably the first, like from an archaeological standpoint, the first evidence of writing is the ancient Sumerian. They even found like school books and stuff, like clay school books with like teachers' corrections and stuff. So it's just like basically civilization has existed for a split second is really what it amounts to. So I think it's very important that we become a multi-planet species while we can, and before technology potentially subsides below the level where it's possible. Like one of the possible scenarios, and I think possibly even a probable scenario, is that our tech level actually drops, just like the ancient Egyptians, just like every civilization, which has gone through, has gone sort of on a sine wave, but ultimately a downward sloping sine wave. So, just like the Egyptians living in Egypt forgot how to build pyramids and read hieroglyphics, we may forget how to build spaceships. And so we should build the spaceships and make life multiplanetary while it is possible.
There is, again, so much wrong in this. The ancient Egyptians and Sumerians did not die out. They became incorporated into other political entities. Ancient Egypt, for example, was conquered by the Persians and then by the Greeks and then by the Romans. They never died out. They continued. Culturally, they continued. Eventually, 1,000 years after their first conquering of their state by the Persians in the late Roman period, people eventually forgot how to read hieroglyphs not because the language had changed, but the script had changed to Coptic. And so that led to the forgetting of hieroglyphs. The ancient Egyptians did not forget how to build pyramids. They consciously chose not to. There is not a sine wave of civilizations trending downwards, and there is never an example of really losing technology. What we see an example of is the losing of large state-level control that leads to the building of large-scale monuments. And that is an issue of organization and administration, not of technology. In many ways, Elon Musk and many people's ideas about societal collapse as this kind of catastrophist doomsday perspective on history is completely misinformed. It simply does not line up with how historians and archaeologists see the details and the evidence that we have from the historical record, as I told Joe Rogan just 1.5 years ago when I was on there. But lastly, I just want to talk about why it matters that we study the past. When we look at scholarship and understanding the collapse of societies, what we usually see is human resilience. It's not like everybody dies. People survive. It's the upper crust of society that disappears. It's the palaces, it's the political structures, it's the major temples, it's the monuments, it's the art. Normal people survive. And so what I want to say is, if you are wealthy and you're listening to this and you're worried about societal collapse, don't Don't go and try to hide from it. You need to invest in our society. That is what your wealth and status is based upon, is our society itself. So you need to invest in the resilience of the people around you and not thinking that you can protect yourself. Because if you look at history, go read these books. Eric Klein's book comes out tomorrow. Guy Middleton's book goes all over the world and looks at collapse. It is the rich and the elites who get eaten. So we have to invest in everyone if we want to survive this. And my own research into climate change at the end of the Bronze Age, what it shows is that the ancient Greeks adapted too late. It took them hundreds of years to realize that the climate had dried, and it took them hundreds of years to adapt their food production systems. And so let's not do that. We understand how the world is changing around us. Let's listen to that and try to invest in our future. Everything we do, whether it's trading stocks, deciding how to fix our plumbing, deciding on what we're going to do, is based on our knowledge of the past. And so we need to invest in our knowledge from the past and what it can tell us so that we can act properly today. Thank you.
Ironically, you sound like you're preparing us for the collapse of civilization.
I already gave that interview.
It sounds like what you're saying.
Yeah.
Sounds like rich people better put your money back into society.
Exactly.
Or we're fucked.
And that's the key. Rich people are the ones who are rich because of society. When we look at what we call a collapse in the past, what we see is the disappearance of monuments. We see the disappearance of palaces. We see the disappearance of wealthy burials. We see the disappearance of the elites. That's what's visible in the archaeological record. That is what disappears. So when we talk about collapse, we're not talking about technological collapses. We're talking about collapses of political states, and we're talking about collapses of elites that then devolve into regionalism and dispersed hierarchies, as we've seen with the fall of Rome. And what is particularly eerie is that these kind of doomsday views on collapse, they inform the entirety of the political, personal, and economic worldview of the world's richest man who has a lot of influence, Elon Musk. And this is just fake history that he is spouting to many people. And as we started with Mary Beard, if you ever see him tweet about history or Roman history, don't believe it. Instead, check out what real historians and archaeologists say, because we have access to the actual evidence and we present the complexity that is our human past. Thank you for listening. Have a good one.
I have to say that if I was to give anybody a warning tonight, I would say that if ever they see a tweet from Musk saying anything about the Roman Empire, go and do a bit of research.
Check it with you first.
Because 9 times out of 10, it is sheer rubbish.
Rhymes and riddles, tickle, tickle, giggles, squiggle, jiggle, fiddle.